In this discussion, I'd like to talk about the Milley-Urey experiment, but would like to begin with the work of Alexander Ivanovich Oparin, who was a pioneer in thinking about how chemical evolution could occur. In 1924, he put forward a hypothesis that gradual chemical evolution of carbon-based molecules occurred in the Earth's primordial soup. He asserted that there is no fundamental difference between a living organism and lifeless matter. The complex combination of manifestations and properties of characteristic of life must have arisen as a part of the process of the evolution of matter. So you can see here that once again the evolutionary thinking assumes the outcome and then tries to come up with a way to explain things in terms of that outcome. He took into account the recent discovery of methane in the atmospheres of Jupiter and the other giant planets. So he suggested that the infant Earth had possessed a strongly reducing atmosphere, meaning one containing methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. So in his opinion, these were the raw materials for the evolution of life, and we're going to see in a few slides that Miller adopted these as his beginning point. In Oparin's formulation, there were first only simple solutions of organic matter, and their behavior was determined by the properties of the atoms themselves and the arrangement of these atoms into a molecular structure. Oparin said that he thought that this process brought biological orderliness into prominence, and that competition, the speed of cell growth, survival of the fittest, the struggle for existence, and finally natural selection determined the form of material organization characteristic of modern-day living things. So you can see he's borrowing in whole from what Darwin wrote some years earlier. Well, then a little bit after that, J.B.S. Haldane, a British subject, wrote in his article 7 years later in The Origin of Life that he thought there was this primordial soup out of which these chemicals then developed the first living being, and this term is now termed abiogenesis. In other words, the genesis of this from non-living material. Well then, in 1953, Stanley Miller, a graduate student working on his PhD degree under Dr. Urey, developed an experiment which we're going to discuss here in just a few seconds, but I'd like to say that he was under the tutelage of Dr. Urey, who had already developed a stellar reputation with his discovery of heavy hydrogen. So here are the amino acids which we see that are used in life, and we see that some of them do indeed occur in meteorites, and that some of these were also made in the experiment of Stanley Miller. Now less than 2% of the carbon, though, in the experiment actually formed amino acids. But it was understood very well by these chemists that oxygen had to be excluded in order for these reactions to take place. So here is Dr. Miller with an reenactment at a much later stage in life of this experiment showing the spark chamber in which those gases were placed. So as following the lead of Oparin, he put into this chamber ammonia, methane, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. And so these were chosen to supply these particular elements needed to produce the amino acids, but ammonia and methane are unstable and decompose in evolutionary timescales. So this is the first of many problems we'll encounter, that these were too unstable. He then greatly increased the concentration of hydrogen because he knew that that was needed to drive the reactions forward in the manner he needed to have happen in order to form amino acids. And now the problem is this type of heavy or high concentration of hydrogen does not occur in Earth's atmosphere, because hydrogen is the lightest element and it escapes our gravity, and so its concentration in air is quite low, nothing like the high concentration that he put into the chamber here in this experiment. Another problem is, as I mentioned earlier, he had to exclude oxygen because he knew that it would react with the products produced in the experiment and rendering those products useless. He also used a constant electrical current trying to simulate lightning that is presupposed to be the source of the energy to cause these reactions to occur. But there's a big difference between the intensity and charge in lightning and current through these electrodes. He then employed a condenser and a trap, a condenser to cool down these gases so that they could be put into liquid form and then go into the trap. And the reason he did this was he understood that the energy that drove these reactions forward would also be the same energy that could destroy the products if they remained in that chamber. So they needed to be removed from the chamber and protected in the trap. And then what was made? Well, yes, amino acids were made, as you saw in that previous diagram, but the greatest portion of the products were toxic byproducts or tar. And formic acid was also one of the products, and formic acid is what makes things sting when ants bite you. That's where the name comes from, for the Latin word for ants. And so again, these are things that are not conducive to life, but are actually conducive to prevent life from occurring. Well, what kinds of amino acids were made? Well, amino acids are either water soluble or they're soluble in fat or oil. Those are the two ways of categorizing amino acids. And what he made were amino acids that were only the water soluble ones. And so the wrong ratio of fat and water soluble products would be nothing like what would be required to make amino acids that we actually have in our body in order to make the proteins. And then there's the issue of handedness. Because this is a spontaneous experiment, 50% of the amino acids produced were left-handed and 50% were right-handed. So you have this racemic mixture, half and half. And what we're talking about here is it's the same molecule, in this case the example of alanine, but one is the mirror image of the other. So if you put your fingers together like this, your hands are the same, but they have the opposite orientation. And so when you lay them down together like this, the thumbs are in the opposite direction. And so as you look at the diagram here in the slide, you can see that these have handedness as well. And so the problem is that in the human body and everything that we eat, whether it be from plants or animals, only the left-handed amino acids are employed. We do not use right-handed amino acids. And so this leads to a problem because if any of the right-handed amino acids are attempted to be incorporated into a protein from these amino acids, it would bring everything to a screeching halt and there would be no protein production. Then there's the issue of other parts of the cell, because in addition to the many thousands of proteins that we have in each cell, and these types of proteins are very different from each type of cell, one to the other, there are many other parts of the cell that are needed to have function. One of these parts is the membrane of the cell, the protective covering, the envelope around the cell. Well, we do know that the majority product, the molecule that is used in our membranes of our cells are a category that we call phospholipids, and they have this shape. And if you spontaneously throw a bunch of phospholipid molecules into water, they will spontaneously form these spheres with a bilipid layer, because the long parts of those molecules don't want to be around water. They are called nonpolar. They dislike water. They are hydrophobic. And the other end of the molecules have a polarity and they like water. They are hydrophilic. And so that's why these molecules arrange themselves spontaneously into this bilayer that has those heads facing the water on the inside and the water on the outside. So then the evolutionists say, aha, this is how membranes can form spontaneously and get us on our way to developing an actual cell. But these are just simply these types of molecules. There's nothing else in these that is required to have a functioning membrane, because we need to have proteins in these membranes that control what gets in and out of the cell. And many different proteins are needed to control many different substances, whether they be sugars, amino acids, other molecules, steroids, hormones, all sorts of things. And so here you see then that if we drop these phospholipids into the water, here is a photograph of actual spheres that are formed in the water called micelles. So these are very nice, but they have nothing to do with the reality of life. And when you look at this diagram of an actual, well, not an actual cell, but a representation of a cell, there are some dozen plus types of little organs in the cell called organelles that have highly specialized functions. And so you can think of the interior of a cell as like a city with many different factories, many different things going on, making different products and doing different types of work. In order to have a functioning cell, all of these things are necessary. And we know this because when there's a situation where mutations occur and any of these organelles cannot function properly, then those things cause disease or death. Well, next thing is this business of intelligent input. Dr. Miller and Dr. Urey, very bright, intelligent men, knew that they had to very carefully plan this experiment so that they would have some chance of success in making the amino acids. So you see this cartoon here saying, if I can just synthesize life here, then I'll have proven that no intelligence was necessary to form life in the beginning. You know, this is extremely ironic because it took great intelligence to design the experiment. And then you see an updated version of this cartoon here with the very same caption, but with 40 years of history having gone by, and now it's updated with monitors and computers and all sorts of other things to work with in the lab, but it's the same caption. If I can just synthesize life here, then I'll have proven that no intelligence was necessary to form life in the beginning. So that it is highly, highly ironic. Well, what about this business of oxygen? We said that oxygen had to be excluded in order for it to not combine with any products made and render them useless. So the assumption of that necessity was that there was no oxygen in the initial atmosphere of planet Earth. However, when the geologists examine the rocks and the deeper rocks that they think represent the time of very ancient time in past when these things were supposedly happening, here is a quotation from a book here. The only trend in the recent literature is the suggestion of far more oxygen in the early atmosphere than anyone imagined. So once again here, the evolutionary assumption driven by the necessity of their model to have an possible chance of functioning is actually negated by actual data when the rocks are looked at and examined. And so here we see that these rocks were obtained from a drilling rig in which cores were drilled deep through the ocean floor to obtain the rocks that are reputed to be from this age of time millions of years ago. Well, even today we see a lot of oxygen in the rocks. For example, especially in northern Arizona and in much of Utah, you see these red-colored rocks because they have iron, oxides of iron, and you see some very beautiful patterns here that result from this oxygen combining with iron and other things to create these beautiful colors. Well, when it comes to this business of not having oxygen in the atmosphere, this causes a real problem because of the known problem of not having enough ozone in the atmosphere to protect us from solar radiation. Especially in the 70s and 80s, there was a real big effort put on to ban the fluorohydrocarbons from spraying products because of their effect on the ozone layer up in the atmosphere. And ozone is made from oxygen. It's 3 atoms of oxygen combined into one molecule. So the ozone layer does protect us from solar radiation. And without that, then what happens is the molecules would be destroyed by this intense solar radiation. And the problem then says you cannot have life with oxygen in the atmosphere, and you cannot have life without oxygen in the atmosphere. So either way, it's a problem for the evolutionary model that is not solvable. So that is strike one. Well, as I mentioned before, when we look at the amino acids, there are over 2,000 types of amino acids, and 20 of which we use for structures in life. And there's actually another one that occurs in certain situations as well. And I mentioned this business of handedness before, and it is a real problem to have 50% left-handed, 50% right-handed to be able to make any kind of a protein at all. And so Miller got the wrong form of amino acids, and this could be strike 2. And then there's the question of, we are told of life starting in the oceans originally, that DNA was developed in the oceans, and this primordial soup, that the phrase that Haldane came up with. But the answer is no, life could not have started in the oceans because water dissolves, breaks down DNA, and this is called hydrolysis, water breaking. And so then the evolutionists had to say, well, okay, we have to acknowledge the laws of chemistry, so this doesn't work. So now if you ask them where they say that life started rather than the oceans, the current thinking on their part is DNA crystals forming in clay. So you can see that as actual data, actual experiments push the evolutionists further and further into a corner, they're being put into a more and more uncomfortable position. So this is strike 3, you're out. And so I'd like just to give you a little summary here to go over this, saying that proteins are chains of amino acids. They form structural components and function as enzymes and do many other things. They act as transport molecules, such as hemoglobin, for example. They have many, many functions. Some short amino acid chains actually serve as hormones and neurohormones. The probability of getting only one small protein of just 100 amino acids is 1 in 10 to the 130th. That's 130 zeros after number 1. And so you can see that's an extremely small probability. It's actually impossible. Borel's law states that if anything has a probability greater, well actually less than 1 in 10 followed by 50 zeros, it just isn't going to happen. And there are thousands of different kinds of proteins in each cell. And as I said before, 100 amino acids is a small protein. Average is about 300. And we have some that have several hundred and even a few thousand amino acids in them. Only the left-handed amino acids can be used. Just one wrong amino acid can cause disease or death. We know this very well with sickle cell anemia. In the 6th position, the substitution of valine into the molecule of hemoglobin causes misshaping, sickling of the cell, of the hemoglobin molecule, and then sickling of the cell, and this results in significant disease and death. So these types of things cannot be ignored. And so this brings us to a conundrum for the evolutionists, because we have to have everything present and functioning at the same time. We need DNA and RNA plus enzymes, proteins that is, enzymes, in order to write across to make the RNA from DNA. But it goes further, we also need RNA and proteins and translation enzymes, these proteins, all 3 of those things in order to make proteins. So you need proteins to make proteins as well as RNA. And then we need enzymes, which are proteins, and DNA in order to be able to copy, to replicate DNA. And so there is this vicious circle here that all of these things need to be present and functioning fully from the beginning to have any kind of possibility of a cell functioning. And when all of these things don't happen correctly, we have disease and death today. So I'd like to give you this verse from Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth. And it was so. And so this is telling us that God put all of the information needed for these plants to be able to reproduce themselves right away, the fruit with the seed in itself for the next generation. So this is the answer to the question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Because it is the chicken with the egg, both at the same time. And that it took great intelligence of our all-powerful Creator to put all of this together so that life can be in existence and it can reproduce. And so this is a marvelous testimony to the power of our all-knowing God, who is all-loving and who simply wants the best for us. And so that's why he gives us the choice, the freedom of choice, to accept him or reject him. Because if he made it mandatory that we did love him, as in that we are loving him without any choice, then that would be very robotic and would not have any meaning. So he gives us the freedom to choose him, to reject or to accept him. And so when we do decide to love him back, to acknowledge our need for the saving grace that he gave us with the death of Christ on the cross, then that is our way of showing him that we love him in return, and we can have that deep personal relationship with him. So with that, I conclude this talk. Thank you very much.